Welcome back, and we have a very special guest tonight. I was just thinking that one of the real dilemmas, it's a good dilemma to have in teaching a course on the American Revolution, is trying to decide which of Pauline Maier's books to assign. And I recommend all of them. Her first book, From Resistance to Revolution, is really the best study of what happens between 1765 and 1775, this critical 10 years when a resistance movement turned into a revolution and a way of understanding how it happened. And then her book, The Old Revolutionaries, is a great collection of essays on the people we regard as the founders, or some of them, Samuel Adams, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, Richard Henry Lee, and really about their changing perspectives after the great event of their lives, the American Revolution, how they looked back on this and how they made sense of the country they had created as it was being born. And probably her most famous book, the one we're reading for this class, is American Scripture, which, as you are finding out, is really the best analysis of the Declaration of Independence and its history as it was being written, and its history since then and its meaning for us. And in addition, she is a prolific writer of essays, reviews, and also an extraordinarily generous scholar in talking to teachers groups, talking to other scholars, making suggestions, and often pointed criticism that does make us rethink things that we thought made perfect sense. And I think another token of her generosity is the fact that she's always willing to come back here and talk to my American Revolution class. And I was just realizing, too, the last time she spoke in the Revolution class, the Red Sox won the World Series. So I hope you will come back.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you. I always think, after introductions like that, I should just bow and leave. It's downhill from here. I'm going to talk rather informally. This is a kind of you've read the book, you're reading the book. It's an opportunity for me to play sage, which I don't often get. And I should explain, however, that if my remarks seem a little discombobulated, that is because I have not been living in 1776 recently. For the last 4 or 5 months, I have been living in the 1780s, and particularly in 1787 and 1788. Today, I've actually been writing a book review of Woody Holton's new book, Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution. But generally, I am in Widener Library in an office which belongs to my husband. They haven't thrown me out yet. I'm writing this book on the ratification of the Constitution. I spent between some point in July and late September, I think, in the Massachusetts Convention. And I mean in the Massachusetts Convention. I was there longer than it met. It met from January 9th to February 7th, and I was there a good 2 months. And you really do feel like you're there after a while. You lose your perspective. I mean, I remember this from back when I was a graduate student writing From Resistance to Revolution. I remember a rather embarrassing conversation I had with a friend who was not a scholar, and thank God just laughed and thought it was sort of charming. But I forget what got me going, and I commented, he talked about some child that disappeared, and I said, oh yes, infanticide's a very serious problem. And he looked at me, it was sort of surprising, and I started telling the story, and I realized I had gotten the Boston Globe from that time and the Boston Gazette from the 18th century mixed up. And the children I was missing had been stolen by Indians, and they weren't around doing that anymore. I just had my world totally confused. Something like that happened a few months ago. I was at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and there was some wonderful occasion for major donors, and there was some lovely woman who turned out to be a descendant of General Benjamin Lincoln, who was the the ex-army officer who led the Massachusetts troops against Shays' rebellion, and was in my state ratifying convention, mind you. And I had been in the same room with this man. You know, I had spent the summer with this man. And here was a descendant. And I went up and I said to her, "You're a descendant of General Lincoln." And she said, "Why, yes." And I said, "Which of his children are you descended from? Could you perhaps be descended from the son who died in the course of the convention?" And she looked at me as if I were from the moon. You know, she didn't have a clue. And this, of course, has led me to think about, to put it concisely, how quickly the past disappears apart from our efforts to capture it, our conscious efforts to capture it. How many of you know very much about your family 3 generations past? You may know your grandparents, your great-grandparents. Do you know anything much? Could you give me 5 minutes on the generation before them? And I suspect the answer is no. We lose it. We lose the past. We are constantly working to recapture it. And that leads me to think a little bit, why do we bother? You know, I mean, I do it all the time, of course, but why? And we're forced occasionally to reflect on why we do it. First of all, there's always the relevance issue, you know. Maybe do we learn lessons from the past that are applicable to our lives? I think that's crazy. We don't. The past was a different country. The exercise of doing history is, for me, an exercise of filtering out as much as we can of our assumptions from the present, of trying to understand what's different about the past. That's the intellectually exciting part about it. But different from what? It has to be different from the world that's familiar to us. And to me, that means relevance is intrinsic. I mean, it isn't a simple thing. You can't just apply it. But we're always coming to understand better what's distinctive about our time as we understand what's distinctive about the past, what's distinctive about the world we live in. So doing history gives us our bearings, if you will. Without it, we don't have, we don't know where we are. We don't know who we are. I think it's important to have that perspective on our own experience. There's another explanation on this that I think about it. It's a kind of a forbidden territory. It's most intellectually unacceptable these days, but it keeps coming back. It has to do with this issue of truth. You know, historians don't believe in truth anymore. We're very good on accuracy. You get your footnotes wrong, your date wrong, oh boy, you're in big trouble. But could you really speak of truth? Truth is always relevant. There are people in the past, and they keep popping up, who think of history in a very different way. I was so moved decades ago when there was a big Goya exhibit at the MFA. I wonder, maybe some of you are old enough to have seen it. I shouldn't stare at anybody, because I remember there was one painting that especially moved me, and it was of history. It was a young woman, mind you, so much for John Adams. History is not for the ladies. Goya's my man. Here was history, a young woman actually, writing in a book as sort of an angel of time, I think, pulled truth out of the shadows. This was important for Goya. He'd lived through a revolution that failed, and he thought the truth would somehow be captured by those who wrote the history of the life of the times he'd lived through. And that's often a consolation. How not often do you hear public figures saying, history will vindicate me? I mean, this is a very awesome role, that we are to be somehow the keepers of truth and justice over time. You know, it's a good reason. It has nothing to do with what most historians do. You know, they are studying, oh, you know what they're studying. It has nothing to do with these large issues. but one other story, I met a classmate of mine who ended up being my dean, and she was an economist. And she said to me, she'd never known me very well. She said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a historian." And she said, "Oh, history, historian." She said, "I always thought of history as having to do with wisdom." Again, it's an awesome idea that somehow as we reflect on the record of human life, we should come to some more intelligent understanding. It's an awesome charge, and it isn't something, historians shirk it for good reason, but it keeps coming back. I can't, you want to know my position on it, I don't know what it is. It is an issue I muse on, if you will. It won't go out of my head. That Goya painting will be with me to my death. And I suppose it will have to come into my writing in some way at some point. Why else do we do history? Because it's so much fun. John Demos, who's now at Yale, I remember saying long ago that, he did it just because it gave him one terrific intellectual charge. I have a colleague who was in mathematics once and just discovered it was just not interesting. It was not complicated enough. So he went into history. There were more variables. It was, it's just so interesting to try to put the pieces together. And that task of somehow spending your life in another century, and then living in another one where the healthcare and plumbing is better. It's a very good life. Well, the story that I am, what about the story that I am telling today, the story I'm working on now, has some connections actually with the story that I told in American Scripture. Certainly the books have a common origin. I believe I told in the introduction of American Scripture how I came to write that book against my better wishes. Arthur Wang of Hill and Wang contacted me, and he was trying to put together a little book for modern students who have a short attention span, and it was supposed to be a short book on a modern history of the Declaration of Independence. There hadn't been one written for a generation, and he thought I was the person to write it, but it was to be in this peculiar series. So it was his idea. Eventually I came to realize I didn't want to write a book in his silly little series that had no footnotes, and I got out of it. Well, that's another story, how I got out of it. Actually, he didn't like an early draft, and he said it's somewhere between a popular book and a scholarly book, and I told him I was going to write a book that was so scholarly that 3 graduate students in the entire United States would want to read it, and since that wasn't what he wanted, maybe he should let me out of the contract, which he joyfully did, and then I went and wrote a popular book for Knopf, which was much better. And I made a lot more money, too. That's also helpful. This book was also not, my husband keeps saying you shouldn't say that, never say that in print anyway, but it was not my idea. Bob Bender from Hill and Wang, not from Hill and Wang, from Simon & Schuster, discovered that there is no book on the ratification of the Constitution. He's almost right. There's a book in German that's never been published in translation, and I don't think it's what Bender was looking for anyway, best I can tell. I don't read German. And there's one that was published in 1966 that doesn't look like it's a history of ratification. It's called The Ordeal of the Constitution, and looks like it's a book on so-called anti-federalists by Robert Rutland. The book is really dated and, to my mind, confusing and actually not very useful because he doesn't cite about a third of his direct quotations, best I can calculate. It does fall between 2 stools, I think. It's also dated because why are there so few efforts? And I think it's because the volume of the documentation is monumental. Think about it. Ratification happened in 13 different states. And the documents for them are in 13 different states, housed in 13 different states, and not in any one place within them. I think literally it would strain the capacity of any individual to master that documentation within a lifetime unless that person lived a very long life and began very young. There I can think of maybe one living historian who might have been able to do it, Forrest MacDonald, but he didn't. He wrote the kind of books that historians do confronted with a massive documentation like that. We ask a question. We find a workable topic that we can take a piece of the documentation and say something about it. So there's a massive scholarship on parts of the story, but not the overall tale. What made it possible for me at not such a young age to take on this topic was that there is a wonderful documentation series that's available now, the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution, which is being published out of this, at Madison, Wisconsin, the State Historical Society of Wisconsin. They have really vacuumed one archive after another, and they printed them, and well, I think there's 21 volumes in print now. It doesn't cover all the states, but it covers enough of them that I think it's time one can write this book using this as a foundation and then dipping into the scholarship of other people. However, that's not much of a link, that they were both suggested by publishing houses. After I wrote American Scripture, I was extremely interested in the responses I got from people. Among them, there were those people that would say, starting with a woman that used to collect books in Widener, "Oh, you're the woman that wrote the book on the Constitution." You know, and this would happen over and over again. And by people who should know the Declaration of Independence isn't the Constitution. A lawyer in the firm that actually housed the literary agency that handled the book referred to me once on the subway to your book on the Constitution. At first I used to correct people. I'd say, well, actually it was on the Declaration of Independence. And they would go, another tedious academic drawing these little lines where none are to be drawn. And so I couldn't take that anymore. I stopped and just started listening and asked why were they so convinced that these were the same thing? Why does it, all these precious national documents, quote unquote, why do they all seem part of the same mishmash to most Americans? You know, Bill Clinton once in his own inimitable style in one of those town meetings somewhere in the Midwest confused the Declaration of Independence with the Gettysburg Address. Do you remember that? I mean, you know, government by the people, for the people, by the people. You know where that comes from, the Declaration of Independence. And you know how many Americans groaned? Not enough, I suspect. So much for Yale Law School. But, okay. Why? Why do we get these confused? I started to reflect on that. And I think it makes some sense. If you've read the book, you'll understand what I'm talking about. And what I'm thinking of, the changes that happened in the way the document was understood starting in the 1790s. In its first incarnation, the Declaration was, of course, a revolutionary manifesto. It was assertion of the right of the Americans to break from Britain. It said we are becoming a member of the world of nations, you know. We are, the right ought to be, free and independent states. A revolutionary manifesto, but by the 1790s that began to change. You know, and what people read in 1776 was the last paragraph. The paragraph that declares independence. That was what was new about the Declaration of Independence. It declared independence. I mean, this is one of the surprising ideas somehow, at least in terms of its domestic significance. Actually, you know, David Armitage at Harvard has written a little book on the Declaration of Independence that returns to that idea, that the significance of the Declaration was that it declared independence. It was the first of that sort in international law at the beginning of a period in which empires were disaggregated. And so he can list a whole series of other new nations that issued similar documents, some with wording that had some connection with that of ours, and others that are entirely different, but that were in their nature descendants from the American Declaration. So that was an independent contribution of significance in a global context. But for Americans themselves, by the 1790s, that wasn't very important. You know, it been there, done that. It was a long time ago. We're on to other issues now. By the 1790s, the Declaration hadn't been read very much. It wasn't referred to very much. And when it was referred to, it was often as the instrument of our independence. But in the 1790s, as I talk about in the last chapter, it became recaptured and reread. And eyes moved from the last paragraph to the second paragraph. Why? And the reason, I think, is that it stated certain ideas, certain principles that were very important in this culture. Ideas that had been stated in state constitutions, or more exactly, state bills or declarations of rights. Statements that, as in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, all men are born equally free and independent. Well, Jefferson rewrote that. But the idea was there, and that they have certain rights by nature that weren't given to them, and that they create governments to protect those rights. Now, Jefferson's long first sentence of the second paragraph went on to assert the right of revolution. That was the point of the sentence. The sentence was written according to an 18th century form that piled phrase on phrase on phrase, and the meaning of this rhetorical form only became clear at the end. Now, if you look at that sentence that way, and that was why I wanted to borrow, remember to get it back. All right, I forgot to grab my copy. If you read the Declaration with that rhetorical form in mind, you can see what I'm talking about. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with, with inherent and inalienable rights. We'll read the Jeffersonian form of it. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government. That when every form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Jefferson wasn't afraid of long sentences. In fact, if you look at the form, how it's printed often, you see officious editors stepping in. They break it up. They put in periods and start new sentences as they think surely Mr. Jefferson must have meant, because nobody writes a sentence that takes up that much space. But if you think of it, how did it end? It is the right of the people to abolish or alter those governments and to institute others. It was an assertion of the right of revolution if a government doesn't protect those rights. That's what the Declaration was originally about. However, of course, culturally, we have edited it. And you could see that happening beginning in the 1790s. If you stop this sentence earlier, it has an entire, and if you continue to think, continue to understand that the meaning is at the end, it has an entirely different function. Suppose you read all this and you stopped. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Or you could even add, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. It says, then the sentence gives a charge to established governments. It's not a revolutionary manifesto. It says any government is founded to protect these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We didn't really have anything like that in the Constitution. We have nothing like that in the so-called Bill of Rights. I say so-called because there's a man, a good scholar at Yale Law School, Kilreed Amar, wrote a little book on the Bill of Rights who says that no federal judge, if I remember his argument exactly, referred to the first 10 amendments to the Constitution as a Bill of Rights until late in the 19th century. Indeed, he found a federal judge who said, unlike the state constitutions, the federal Constitution has no Bill of Rights. And it was stuck on at the end, like an afterthought. If you look at the Virginia or the Massachusetts Constitution, which is still in effect, the Declaration of Rights is right at the beginning. That's the purpose of it. You know, this is what we stand for. These are both what our governments should enforce and what limits them. They are the basis of our compact with each other. So Massachusetts had one, but not the United States. We only came to think of this as it, and indeed those 10 amendments only became of much importance to this country after the post-Civil War amendments and the incorporation of the first 10 amendments into the body of the Constitution, which happened more or less starting in the 1920s. So, you know, but they sort of understood this didn't quite scratch these amendments that Congress put on with a begrudging attitude. Didn't quite scratch the itch. So people revived the Declaration. The Sons of Englishmen, they thought it should be written on paper. And the only place these ideals were the Declaration of Independence. So it was revived and was our most important Bill of Rights through the 19th century. It's the Declaration that Abraham Lincoln cited in terms of rights, not the first 10 amendments. Okay, now let's get back to my question. Why do Americans get them confused? Well, these words were adapted, I believe, from a state Declaration of Rights, the Virginia Declaration, written by George Mason. And if we have, in fact, transformed it into a de facto statement of rights that governments are to protect into a Bill of Rights, well, we all know bills of rights are supposed to be parts of a Constitution. Ipso facto, you can confuse them legitimately. There's a logic to our national confusion. Now, that may be pushing it a bit too far, but I think that's probably the answer, that there is some instinctive understanding of the function that we have attributed to the document that explains why we get at least the Declaration, well, in the Constitution of the Bill of Rights, rather confused, at least rhetorically. All right, but what you're talking, yes, sir.
Well, I just thought of a simple way to put this problem of viewpoint and the commingling of later and earlier.
Yeah.
Take Bill Clinton as an example.
Right.
And people would not consider it all odd to say when President Clinton was a baby. But when he was a baby, he wasn't president. He was
Yes.
not even Bill Clinton. He was, when he was born, he was an unnamed child.
Yes.
Now that's the sort of statement that a historian would rightly make. Hey, wait a minute.
When
Don't
President
say
Clinton was a baby.
President Clinton, he wasn't Bill Clinton, then you completely misunderstand his meaning to his family if you impose that later value on the early family structure.
Right.
So the historian has an important role to play, saying, wait a minute, you're confusing things. But at the same time, it's entirely understandable that this happens.
Sure.
Because we all are living on the other side.
Right. And it's almost impossible to filter out entirely the assumptions we have from our own experience and our own world. I've said we're always trying to filter out our modern conceptions to understand the past in our own terms, but we're fated to fail because we can't do it entirely. We're always swimming against a very strong tide, I think, in trying to do that. And your example is certainly one where we're a good example of our doing it. Yeah, right. Well, I didn't want to leave this podium without talking about your topic for this week, which is independence. You've read, I assume, the book or parts of the book, and we can talk about it later. We have some questions and answers about that, or anything you want to talk about is fine with me. There are a couple, I think, major points that I would emphasize about my treatment of it. One, are you amazed at how long it took for Americans to commit themselves to independence? There was still a tremendous amount of resistance after Lexington and Concord. I mean, even the Massachusetts legislature or provincial Congress wanted to get the stories, these sort of grotesque stories about the atrocities committed by the British troops to Britain in the hope that it would awake sympathy and lead toward redress of grievances so that oh please, could they just remain British? And that this remained general, that there were so many states that simply instructed their delegates of Congress that they could do nothing except work for redress of grievances on through late 1775, when the war had not only begun, but had progressed quite far. Common sense, obviously, which you're also reading, has a major role in the change. What exactly the impact of common sense is open to dispute. I think that some of the state and local documents that I have in one of the appendices and that I discuss in the second chapter gives us a handle on that. Members of Congress were very eloquent in reporting their observations that what had been a no topic, nobody talked about independence earlier. It was, what was it, I think of Harriet Beecher Stowe saying people couldn't talk about slavery or their anti-slavery convictions. It was a topic you were supposed to not talk about until she published Uncle Tom's Cabin. Well, that unfreezing of discussion was something that common sense also did. What the congressmen said whenever they traveled, people were talking about it. But they were talking not just about Paine's arguments, they were talking about independence itself. When they finally explained, as they do in their state and local documents, why they thought independence was necessary, they did not repeat Paine's argument. Why did Paine defend independence? Who's going to tell me? What was his argument? Ah, silence. Well, I'll tell you what his argument was. His argument was that the British form of government was never going to give the Americans the freedom that they wanted because it was fundamentally flawed. When I teach common sense at MIT, where I have been for now an awful long time, I start by asking my students if there's anything in this pamphlet that would lead them to think it was written by a man who said his greatest contribution was the design of an iron bridge. Then I just don't say anything and I wait to see what they say. And they say, what kind of a screwy question is this? And one year I have a student who said to me, you know that part in the beginning where he says, he states a principle of nature that things, this basically is if something, a design should be simple because it's less likely to be disordered, and if it does go wrong, you can find the problem more easily. And on the basis of this principle in nature, he said, let us examine the so much boasted Constitution of England. Student said to me, you know, that's a basic principle of engineering. It's known as the KISS rule. Keep it simple, stupid. And there's a lot in that pamphlet that shows a kind of an engineering mentality. If you start looking for the mechanical analogies, are all over the place. You know, if one roll is heavier, one wheel is heavier than the other, what happens? And he applies that to the Constitution as a mechanism. And if you think about it, a Constitution is a kind of a machine. If a machine is a creature, a creation of human beings to serve their purposes, a Constitution has to fit in that category. Of course, I've made my own definition to make my point, which is a little disingenuous, but you see there's something to be said for it. And then he says it's a flawed mechanism. There are two constitutional errors. There's monarchy and there is hereditary rule. And the only good part is the Republican part, which was essentially the House of Commons where people were elected. And then at the end, he gives you proposals of a new government. And what does he do it? Does he say, this is what you should do? He said, no. We're not going forward because we don't know what to do next. It's perfectly clear. The British Constitution is no good. We have to start over. So we're just scared. We don't know where to go next. Look, let's start talking about this. I'm going to throw out a plan. And just in the hope that somebody else will come up with a better one. Look at his plan. It's extremely interesting. And if you look at what happens in terms of Constitution writing in the American states and later in the Constitutional Convention against that model, you start to see what the issues were. What I think the importance of common sense was that it transformed the debate. It went from one over who's responsible, although that continued, to a debate over the forms of American government. When people started arguing, explaining though, what did they say? They say over and over again, oh, how we loved the king. Oh, how we wanted to be British. Oh, we still want to be British. We give this up with such sadness, but we don't really have a chance. I mean, boy, we've tried over and over. We sent petitions. He didn't read them. He turned his guns and this little place, Falmouth, Maine, which they shelled to, you know, it was awful. Told people, get out of here in a couple hours. A couple hours. All right, we'll give you a little longer. And then they just leveled the place. Still don't know why they did that. It was ridiculous. And then, of course, they burned Charlestown after Battle of Bunker Hill. In general, they looked at the failure of petitions, the war. Oh, the hiring of German soldiers was really the final blow. They said, we don't, you know, to stay here, we're just going to get smashed. It's the first law of nature, self-preservation. We have to be independent. And then as the Freeman, or the county, Freeman in Buckingham County, Virginia, in the first document, I think Appendix B, very eloquent, they say, you know, we can hope to get some help from another country. And what they're thinking about, of course, is France. France will help the United States and had already helped the United States, but it wasn't going to help it wasn't going to help put together the British Empire. It wanted to take it apart. It was getting back at its enemy. So what they required was independence, but not necessarily a declaration. They required the fact of it, not the piece of paper that was written. Of course, that raises the whole question, what was the point of the piece of paper that was written? And I think the point of it was for domestic consumption. It was a way of telling people that the Congress had made this decision. Gary Will said it was written for the King of France. Now that is one piece of unpersuasive argumentation. And when they put all this stuff about those enlightened principles that governments are the servants of the people, all men are created equal, that's for Louis XVI. Yeah, Gary, yeah. You know, it just wasn't true. And it was the fact of independence, and so it was circulating. Okay, so that's how long it took is really what's amazing. It really wasn't until the last minute. And the other point is how important it was that the people went along with it. This goes back actually to the Whig theory that fed into the whole revolution, that shaped the whole revolution, what the Americans called revolution principles. These were principles that described government as the foundation, as the creation of a compact, rulers as trustees, put in office because to serve the people's interests in certain defined ways, and that if they didn't do that, if they violated the people's rights, the people have a right to displace them. All the principles that are stated quite clearly in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. But it was always understood that people couldn't do this just casually. There were limits on it because liberty required law. And among the rules, well, you couldn't go to force at the first instance. You couldn't respond just to private failings. There had to be major issues, major threats to liberty, threats that were recognized by the body of the people. Legitimate revolution couldn't be the work of a small elite. It had to be based on the body of the people. Well, what did that mean? What it meant in an operational way was that all these resistant organizations had to try to get a broad base of support, and you can see it from 1765 with the Sons of Liberty, which were not secret elite organizations. They published their minutes in the newspapers, and they tried to get as many people involved as possible. It was also true of the non-importation associations. And ultimately, the First Continental Congress sets up the Continental Association and created a revolutionary infrastructure, basically, of local committees elected by those who are qualified to choose members of the lower house of the Assembly. It's extremely important that this is based on popular consent and that the people are behind it. You see that in the committee that said, where they're, when they're, after Richard Henry Lee made his motion for independence and the Congress went into the committee of the whole to discuss this, the ultimate decision is we can't go ahead right now because the people aren't behind us yet. We can't get ahead of the people. But opinion is ripening quickly and will be there by, say, early July, when in fact they decided it did appear they had requisite popular consent. Now, fast forward a little bit to where I was this afternoon or this week, roughly 1788. What we see going on with the Constitution is the same process in reverse. That you needed the sovereign people to consent to the disestablishment of the old regime, but you also need them to ratify the new regime. Constitutions are ratified by the sovereign people. And the federal constitution was committed for ratification not to legislatures, but to, of course, conventions elected by the people. This followed an example. It was a rough following of the example of ratification in Massachusetts, where the whole system did not come out of, your gray-haired academics. It came out of people in the towns who thought this through. A wonderful democratic process. People like Concord or Pittsfield that said legislatures can't write and ratify constitutions, or they won't respect them. They won't be bound by them. They can change them. The constitutions have to be acts of the sovereign people.